Hi everyone, it's Fabian Geyrhalter. You're listening to the Headsmack podcast.
You are listening to conversations with misfits, mavericks, and trailblazers.
Hey, welcome to the Headsmack podcast. My name is Paul Pavolny, and I am excited to have another misfit with me. Fabian Geyrhalter, I am excited to have him with us. He is a brand strategist and creative executive with deep expertise in guiding companies through their brand transformations. He has been sought out by companies such as the Marriott, Warner Brothers, Match, Honeywell, Arajet, and Randstad. His thoughts on branding have appeared in publications like Inc., Forbes, Entrepreneur, and the Washington Post, and his creative direction has won over 50 international awards. Now, all 4 of his books have become international Amazon bestsellers and go-to resources for entrepreneurs and marketers alike. Fabian, how you doing, man?
Nice intro. Doing well. Thank you. Thanks for having me. It's going to be fun.
Yeah. Looking forward to this conversation. If you have any interest in all about branding and brand strategy, you're going to love this conversation because Fabian is an expert in this, and he wrote the book on it. He wrote several books on the topic, and his content and his wisdom and his insights are going to be amazing for you if you want to build a brand. So, Fabian, I want to hear a little bit about your origin story. I love superheroes. I love everything about origin stories to find out who you were and how you became who you are now. And so share a little bit about your origin story. Obviously, you're not from LA. And so I want to hear a little bit about that. And then also how you kind of got into what you're doing now.
Yeah. No, totally. I'm going to try to keep it fairly brief. So I'm originally from Vienna, Austria. I came to Switzerland to study at Art Center College of Design, which is a design school. I studied communication design, which back in Europe they called graphic design, communication design, which I love because that's what you do. You communicate through design rather than doing something pretty, which is graphic, right? So did that. Then the campus closed and they gave us the amazing opportunity. Why don't you go to the other side of the world and finish your studies in Los Angeles? And that's why I finished my studies. Right out of school, I became a creative director in a very small pharmaceutical event type company. It wasn't the most glorious of positions in the beginning coming out of school. You're thinking you're going to do something really, like crazy cool.
Yeah.
It was really crazy cool though, because I got my visa through it. I was able to work in the US, coming from Europe. And I was able to, within 3 years, build an entire creative team, which is crazy coming out of school.
Wow.
It ended up being really great. Then I became the creative lead at an interactive agency where I was overseeing the Acura creative account from the design perspective, right? So that's the luxury or the mid-level luxury brand of Honda, right? Acura.
Yeah.
And that was cool. And then the minute that I had my green card, I started my company. I'm like, I'm out of here. So there might have been a time before where I was already freelancing. But my first client was MGM. So very Los Angeles United Artists, and working with a lot of movie studios at that time, which was really, really fun. And I did everything for everyone, right? I'm the kid 6 years out of school. I'm like, oh, interactive, sure. Print, sure. Brand, sure. Whatever it is. My first intern was like in my loft studio, and it was just like, it was slowly growing, and then it ended up turning into a small brand agency, which I was running for like a good 12 years. We were up to 18 people at some point.
Wow.
Serving all kinds of clients. But yeah, there's going to be most probably a Headsmack moment coming up soon in that story. So that's why I'm going to have a hard stop right here. So so that.
And I do want to get to that, but I do want to also backtrack a little bit because, you mentioned you went to school for design and graphic design. How did that, were you a creative kid growing up?
Yeah, you know what? I was a creative kid that, as a kid, I was able to draw. When I turned into my teens, I was not a great illustrator. I wasn't, that was not my gift. But I was like an idea kid. Like I always liked to come up with concepts and strategies and like design ideas. Then the execution, I'm like, who's going to do this for me, right? So that was right. And God, I'm like, I'm going to, date myself here, which is okay because I turned 50 like 4 days ago. But I'm like, back in the day, that's when Photoshop came out. That's when like all of these tools came out. And it was like perfectly timed. And suddenly I was capable to study graphic design even without being the hands-on amazing illustrator and drawer and renderer, right? So that enabled me to actually, figure out, ideas to execution. But I'm still, and to this day, I'm more drawn to like the strategic part and like coming up with the concepts, and then the pixel pushing. I'm okay having someone else do it, And I hope Jesse, my creative director, is not listening to this.
Yeah. So how did you learn about graphic design? Because for most people, for kids, that's really not part of what they think. They don't really think about graphic design. They think about art. They think about creativity. They think about creating pretty things. But graphic design, or art with strategy. When did that awareness come to you?
I like the way you said art with strategy because that's really what it is. Listen, Paul, I from like age 8 on, I was into music. And my dad was a musician, and I just started collecting records. Like literally with 8-9 years, all I wanted was records, right? Which to this day I'm doing, and I've got like 2,000 of them now. But it's like back in the day, a record was 50% graphic and 50% music, right? Like you had the visual, and then what it did to me, it actually branded an artist or a band, and then I knew how the next release, it's going to have the same logo of the band, it's going to have a visual and it's kind of subliminal over like my teenage years. It really taught me about creating conceptual art, creating strategies that have to go through an entire album, so like a year or two with like different singles that have to all come. It's literally brand architecture. It's brand consistency. It's really funny. And I never really thought that much about it. So thanks, Paul.
Well, and
this is really good. This feels good.
Yeah. Well, and the reason I bring it up, because I have a very similar story to yours, is, I was a creative kid. I was a creative thinker. I was an out of the box thinker. I was, kill the sacred cows, questioning things, very creative, but I wasn't that great at drawing. And so, as a kid, I was like, my mom would say, well, what are you going to do with your life? How are you going to make a living drawing pictures? Right. And, I would see other kids in school that were like these amazing, at least in my mind, it was like, that looks like a photograph, it was like, and I would be like, I can't draw that well. And it wasn't until a teacher recommended, have you ever thought about communication arts? I think they called it then, or something. I'm a little older than you, but and I was like, well, I don't know what that is. They're like, well, they create the advertising and things like that. And I was able to go to a agency and spend kind of like a week of job experience, work experience at an agency. And I saw that they took other people's art and they took other people's photographs and they took other people's things and they put it together in a nice way. And I'm like, I think that's what I want to do, because I can't draw those pictures. I can't do the art, but I can really kind of strategically put that stuff together in a beautiful way. So it's a very similar story. So that's why I'm always curious as to where
I like that,
where that trigger happened for you.
And what's interesting, and this is kind of its own little Headsmack moment there. When I turned 18 and it was time to figure out like, where does he study? What is he going to do? Right. I wanted to become a snowboarder. I was big into snowboarding. It was my thing, right? Like, it's the kid who just wants to like, I want to do this forever, right? And the parents are like, not a good idea. Like, that's not a good idea. And I'm like, it's a fantastic idea. And they're like, well, didn't you like graphic design? Isn't that what you want to do? And so we basically got to this point where we just said, you know what, let's have someone else figure this out for you. And back then, this was so cool, still blowing my mind. There was a guy in Vienna who was basically a job psychologist. Like he was basically a guy you went to for 2 days straight. It was really intense.
Wow.
Where he just asked you, it was like gathering insights, right? Like he asked you all kinds of questions, did everything from math tests to like physics to like creative tests to, and then in the end, he had this chart, right? 2 days later.
Yeah.
And everything from your intelligence quotient to like, it was scary. Like here's an 18-year-old who like thinks he rules the world. And it's like, this is really who you are. And I'm like, oh my God. So we sat there, my parents and me, and he basically revealed what's going on with this kid, right? Polly, you're not going to believe this. This was amazing. It's like, he's like, I have never in the years that I've done this had a chart that is identical with someone else's chart. And I'm like, oh God, who's this person, right?
Yeah.
The person was an art director in New York who came from Vienna, and then he made it to New York and he became an art director. Fast forward 3 years, I'm a creative director in LA, right?
Wow.
I mean, it's just, I mean, it's kind of like crazy, right?
Yeah,
so that was a pretty cool moment.
Yeah, yeah, and well, and it's realizing that creativity has many forms as well, and as I mentioned, design or good design is art plus strategy. Design without strategy is art. That's
Exactly.
it's got to have that component of strategy to it. And so as you ventured out onto your own, and at what point did you start formulating your own idea around brand strategy? How early on did that start formulating, and what were those influences?
Very late. I was very much brand focused in the sense of execution, right? Design. I loved creating logos. I was very hands on until very, very late in the company formation, and at some point I finally gave it up. But it really didn't happen until I collaborated with someone else on a project, and that person was a brand strategist, and she came in and she did the whole thing. And I'm like, this is half weird, half cool. Like, I'm not sure what to make out of it, right?
Yeah.
And then the more I worked with clients afterwards, I'm like, this thing is missing that she did, but I think I can do that too. And I actually think I can do it in a different way, right? So I briefed my team back then to like, let's start formulating our own process, which of course there's nothing proprietary around it. These are all, I mean, maybe there's like 20% out of 100% of like these exercises that, we came up with, but usually this is kind of like a framework, right? And it's more about how you use it, right? And so for me, it started with like a 3-hour session, right? And then it turned into a 4-hour session. And, I charged like a couple $1,000s for it. And, like now it's like a full day, 8 hours, right? We charge $14,000 for it. And it's like me with the entrepreneur or the C-suite in a room. And literally within a day, we derive the brand strategy. We figure out the positioning. We figure out how to differentiate. We really figure out where the brand goes. And I like that because as I started working more and more with, startups that need to go at the speed of light, they're like, we don't have time for PowerPoint presentations and buy-ins, and you tell us the strategy and then we come back. And that's how it used to be. It was like a creative presentation.
Yeah.
Here are 3 ways you can go. Let's meet again in 2 weeks with more charts. And that's not how I work. I'm like, come on, like get it out of the person and then make sure it fits correctly into the marketplace. But then let's go. Let's just move on.
Right.
So at some point I started doing this, and actually that was my key Headsmack moment of how this whole thing came about, because it really changed the way I work, the way what gets me excited, the way I look at projects and outcomes. And so there was a pivotal moment right there that made me work in a certain way.
Right. So when you started, when you became aware of brand strategy, because it almost seems like it's a new thing or a trendy thing that wasn't talked. It doesn't seem like it was talked about as a deliverable or as a line item or part of a proposal. It almost seemed like it's become a new thing. So when did that separation happen, and what was that early version like, and what is the version like now?
Yeah, I mean, it happened about 14 years ago, and it's interesting because when you say that the whole strategy part became kind of a thing, I do have to sadly take a little bit of credit for that, because I was on Chris Doe's podcast, and it was all about, Fabian, you're doing strategy? What does that mean? How does that work? What's brand strategy? And I basically told all of these hundreds of thousands of kids out there that if you're a graphic designer, you too could become a brand strategist.
So
and now
it's your
like
fault.
the world, the world is littered with brand strategists, and it's like it's amazing. Yeah. No, but really, what happened is that my agency at the time was going through some through a pivot. I had to change things. I had to basically grow up running the agency, and I hired this guy called David Baker. He's a guy that comes into like smaller creative agencies, and he helps them position themselves. Which, even though that's what a lot of creative agencies do for clients, that's what and it was so cool because he came in, he charged back in the day, and that was about 15 years ago now. He charged like $10,000 a day, right? And I'm like, oh my God, like I hope this is the right thing to do, right?
Yeah.
But something really pivotal happened in my mind. So this guy comes in, and he's a hero already because he charges $10,000 a day and he sits here, right? And he wrote the books, right? And I'm like, oh my God, like this guy. So a couple of things happened. You trust this guy wholeheartedly, right? Because you're spending a lot of money, and he wrote the books. And then you do what he says because of all of that, right?
Right.
And so I was sitting in this conference room for a full day with him, and he interviewed my staff, and we go back and forth, and we do charts and all of this stuff. And then at the end of the day, he basically helped me reposition my agency, which was good. But what I learned the entire time, I'm like, I want to be like you. I'm like, I know you tell me to do these things, but I want to do this. I want to go into people's offices. I want to charge a good amount of money, create really good strategy that's going to change their entire future around. And I want to be that leader that can do that. I want to write the book. And so literally fast forward a year later, I'm launching my first book. I start doing brand strategy workshops in a day, and it's totally different from him, but like I used his blueprint. And so the money I spent on him was so well done because it really changed. I've done, in the last 15 years, I've done 200 plus of these workshops now, flying around the world, seen amazing places, and really, really made a huge impact on those companies. And it feels amazing.
Yeah, wow. So it's all your fault. So I understand that.
Not all of it, but I do take credit for some of the fault, which you need to have someone to blame, and usually it's the consultant. And that's what I am. So blame me on this. Yes.
Yeah, I've had Christo on the podcast as well, and he we talked about the kind of the evolution of brand strategy and everything. He didn't blame you, so he's not holding you accountable.
Well, he's taking the credit. That's what he does. And you know what? He might have talked about brand strategy a long time before me. Right, could easily be, but it was just interesting because here's this guy who was a designer like everyone who's listening, and suddenly he's like, it's not that difficult, you can make good money, and everyone's like, what? So,
so and with everybody saying, I could do this, I could make good money, where do you think that strategists that are out there doing it, where are they getting it wrong and where are they getting it right?
I mean, I think it's so easy to get wrong, and look, I'm still nervous every time I do one of these workshops. I do one today, later, a half-day workshop, right? And I'm still nervous every time I do it because I feel like there's a really good amount of pressure on getting it right if you promise that you can do it in a day or you can do it in a half day or whatever it is, right? And that company is going to change direction. And that company employs people. And there's a future, and there's private investment in it, and there's all kinds of private equity. It's not just like, hey, I'm a designer, and I think I can have a questionnaire and fill out a couple of points, and that I call brand strategy, because it's not. It's like there's emotional intelligence, there's reading the room, there's figuring out like the economy and the competitors, and feeling like who is in the room, who needs to call the shots, who should get depromoted. Like there's so much that needs to come together magically. It's like when a band goes onto a stage, which is ridiculous, right? But I mean, the minute that you're not nervous anymore and you want to really please and you want to read the room, you want to figure out what's going on and like do the improvisations and whatever it is, the minute you're not nervous, you're calling it in, everyone knows. Everyone knows.
True. Yeah, absolutely.
You feel it, right?
Right.
So I think with a lot of brand strategists today, they come from the graphic design world, which is a very different kind of thinking. Right. So you and I, where we already come from the strategic thinking, creative part, and not the paint by the numbers creative part, or like I
Right,
can,
right,
create pretty things.
right.
Depends on which school you come from.
Right. Well, and that is true, because it's not just collecting enough information to make something pretty. There's so much depth that goes into a proper strategy. And with having the right strategy, there's so much value to it, even down the road, in how you're communicating, how you're presenting, how you're positioning, there's so much involved. It's not just let me get enough information to make something pretty for you. And hopefully you like
Exactly.
it,
It's not a creative brief. We're not
Right.
building a creative brief. We're building a platform for a brand to completely change, right? It's
Right.
amazing.
Right. Well, somebody once said in brand therapy post, they said that branding shortens the journey from maybe to definitely. What did you mean by that?
Yeah, that somebody is me. So, so it's basically, the whole idea is to get someone to buy into something, right? To get someone to believe in something, to have a joint vision, and to share an excitement for your product, for your service, for your brand, right? And so if you have the right brand strategy and you really identify why you exist and why you will connect with a certain audience. You might not connect with another audience, which is great, but the audience that you're going to connect with, that spark is really what brand strategy is, and brand design, and all of that, right? And so that distance is extremely shortened if you figure this out quickly and strategically, and you create a blueprint, rather than, well, let's try a couple of Google ad campaigns and see what sticks.
Yeah,
It's a good way to do it after the fact, of like, let's test creative, but you don't test strategy like that, right? Like that is something that really needs to be very emotional, you know?
Yeah, I love that. And so before we continue, one thing that I like to ask people that are involved with branding and brand strategy in particular is even the conversation about what is a brand and what is branding, and what is the difference between the two, and do you have a different definition that you've kind of leaned into that you like right now? Because mine's constantly evolving.
Mine too.
So what's your current version of the difference between brand and branding?
Okay, well, I have, every time I'm asked this question, I have a different answer. So let's see what it could be today. So look, I today, in January 2025, I see a brand being a product or service with a soul, right? And that does not mean that it's like yoga, crazy, like, oh, it's soul. It's like, no, you're human. There's a personality. It's a personality you can connect with. It's like when you go through your feed of TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, X, whatever you do, the brands that you follow yourself because you want to hear from them, there is no difference in the way that you look at those posts than you look at the posts of your friends. You interact with them, you read them, you're interested. That is a brand. That's soul, right? That there's something there. You opt in for that, right? And branding is the vehicle to get you to that and to keep that spark alive, right? So that's really the difference. Branding is what fuels it, and brand is the vehicle that connects.
Right. And that's a great definition. That's one that I haven't heard, and I like that too. The way I usually define it is, your brand is what people think and feel about what you say and do, and branding is everything you say and do. So
I like that.
Yeah. I mean, it really is, because in 2025, everything you do, every interaction, every word, every image, every video, every if you've got a physical engagement, every walk through the door, every approach to the park, all of that stuff is branding, but it's not your brand. And so, saying that I have a brand is not like you have a logo, and it's very, very different.
Exactly.
And so when it comes to creating a brand, what are some, you wrote the book on it, you wrote on building a brand. What are some of the, when it comes to launching a brand, what are some of the first things that you start with that you help an organization or a company with? What are some of the first things that you say, okay, here's what we need to start settling to build this foundation of where you're going to go next?
And a lot of this, it's interesting because it's the simplest of questions in a way, right? But it is complicated because it changes depending on the organization, right? So I had a client call me, a potential client and a former client call me yesterday, and he's like, Fabian, we need to rebrand. We want you to do everything. Send me, I sent you the check. Let's go. And I'm like, hold on, let's talk about this,
Yeah.
right? Like why and where does it hurt and what is the right? So there is a formula of how to create. Let's say you're starting a company and you have budget and you say, let's go. There's an absolute formula, right? Brand strategy, brand name, logo, and then, all of the brand files and kind of like the style sheet and really figuring out everyone's going to sing the same tune. That's how it usually is done. Most often than not, it's more complicated than that, and that's why brand strategy, again, is so important to really define what needs to happen. And I think it's really exciting right now, this day and age, where now that you probed me on brand and branding, I would say branding, right, is evolving in the sense of it's more and more organic. Right? Like that idea of seeing these stale 400-page style guides sitting on someone's desktop or now on some website that you forgot the login, right? It's not how it works anymore. You still need to have that, but you need to evolve. It might easily be that you set brand colors in January and come July, you feel the need based on the environment and the zeitgeist and how things change and competition coming in, that you want to add a tertiary color. You want to suddenly do this element. And that's how it should be. It's crazy if you stay so rigid for like 3 years or 5 years, which quite frankly, this is what 20 years ago we all used to preach. This is it. You're good for a long time. Go. Right.
Yeah.
But I mean, in order for you to stay relevant, AKA on social media, right, as a brand, you need to move quickly. There might be a whole new platform out tomorrow that needs your assets to behave a different way, to be animated, to be, right? So it changes so dramatically. Remember when that app came out where it was all about voice and it was all about talking and it was all about like, what was it? Not chat room. It was something. You remember?
Yeah,
right?
yeah, I totally remember.
All right, we're gonna get like
the name of it.
Everyone will say it in the comments, and we're gonna get like. But it was funny because it was this big thing for
right.
6 months, and then it was gone, and like I never heard about it. Right? Like it's like, but if you're a brand, how do you do that? You don't even have a voice. You don't even have the people to do that. Like I'm talking a big brand, not a D2C startup brand where the founder is the puppet, right? But like literally. So that's why to answer your question in a long winded way, you set the standards, but then you empower the teams on the client side to have fun with it, to play with it, to expand upon it. Let's check in 2 months from now. What needs to change? What changed? Do we need to course align? That, I think, is how great brands work these days. And I love being a part of that. I love jumping in like 2 months later. I'm like, what happened? And sometimes people just go rogue like they always used to do. But sometimes they're really great design elements being added or new. Like, hey, we changed some of our headlines and we think this could become a tagline. Is this future-proof? What do you think? Right. And it's like, let's talk to the CEO about the vision map. Like, where does the company go? I think it's future proof. Let's go. Right.
And that comes from a place of strategy because, anytime you bring in a new designer, whether it's a freelancer, whether it's a new hire, they want to put their creative spin on stuff. And so they can quickly break a brand. But if you have a strategy for evolution, and I always kind of use the idea of, execute, evaluate, evolve, execute, evaluate, evolve. And it kind of cycles around. And you've got to constantly be in that cycle. Even as a brand, you execute, you evaluate where things are at and all kinds of metrics on that, and you evolve. And then you execute that, and then you evaluate and evolve. And, I think a perfect example of that is something that happened recently is even Walmart. What are your thoughts on the Walmart? Now, some people are calling it a rebrand. I would call it more of a refresh or an evolution, not a revolution.
It's like a touch. Poof.
Yeah.
Look, this happened during the crazy fires last week here in LA. So the last thing I looked at is stare at the 2 Walmart logos and like the tiny little nuances. But all I know is that it was a very tiny nuance. I think a lot of time what happens is we like to judge logos and how they change based on our own naive way of seeing that brand. And I say naive, not because we're all idiots. We're all not. But we have no idea what happens inside the company.
Right.
We have no idea what goals need to be met. We have no idea why these changes are made. We really don't. To the outside, it's just like, oh, is it nicer or is it less nice? Does it feel more useful?
It's
or
all
not?
subjective,
So we all like to talk about it, but it's all completely useless, our opinions about it in that way, because like you and I know, and a lot of people listening, there's a lot happening in the boardroom, and we don't know why that happens. There was a rebrand that we did where all we did is we filled a shape that was empty with a color, and the color that we used was like 10% hipper and 10% brighter than the original color.
Right.
That was it.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And we got paid good money, and we did it all in 1 month. But it was literally, if you just looked at that and you're like, oh, great. So you filled it and you changed the color. That takes me 30 seconds.
Yeah.
But that was an international financial institution. They have they're all around the world. That color, you can't make huge changes. Walmart, what are you going to do? It's like, oh, what a missed opportunity. No, you gotta slow changes. Like just to kind of like keep up with the times.
Yeah.
And there are real reasons, right? There are real reasons because it's not as competitive anymore. It looks stale. Something needs to give. Like the product is usually innovating like crazy, but the brand is falling behind. And that's when people call me. They're like, we're doing so well in product, but we don't even like our brand. It's like we haven't even touched it, right?
Yeah.
And then you need to speed up to get the brand to the level above the product, and then the product catches up. But guess what? At some point, you got to keep playing that game, and that's why I'm saying it is organic. And I think that's what happened with Walmart. Again, I haven't studied it because there were more important things to do last week.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, and the way I see it too, and I haven't fully looked into strategy and all of that behind it, but from a surface, from a subjective opinion, is what I'm seeing is, and you had mentioned this earlier, is as technology changes, as culture changes, we never thought about app icons before. We never thought about avatars before. We never thought about favicons. We never thought about that stuff when it came to brands. And so we have to evolve our brand and our branding to match what's happening in culture. And so what I see even with Walmart is, they fattened up the letters to make readability better. It's a cleaned up font, a tighter font. The little star or burst icon, they've fattened that up and tightened it up so it works nicely on apps and smaller and things like that. So they're little they're little changes, they're little refreshes. It's a little evolution. It's not a revolution. It's an evolution that is aligning itself where culture is. They've richened the blue. The blue was a kind of more of a faded blue, and they've made that richer. And so now they've got a very clear, strong color palette. And so I think there's value in looking at where a brand can evolve, right? But here's another one that I want to ask you about, is one that didn't have an evolution, that had a revolution, and it sparked a lot of controversy, and you probably know where I'm going, is Jaguar. What are your thoughts on...
I don't say that because of the question. I say it because of that subject, right? Because it's just, oh boy. I mean, it has been discussed so much. And look, I mean, I actually owned the Jaguar at some point. I mean, there is a lot of legacy, and it is really, really, really harsh to just completely eliminate that legacy. And suddenly you start celebrating all the other ones that do these small touch-ups because they keep it alive, right? With Jaguar, I think the biggest problem, half the problem is, yes, you just eliminated the legacy, which for someone like Jaguar is a very, very big deal and most probably not the smartest move.
Right.
But if you back it up with a campaign that, car designers can do overnight, or I can do in any AI program right now, right? That has absolutely no depth.
Right.
And it's all about, we're a lifestyle brand now. We're going to be more fashion. We're doing all this stuff. It's like, oh my God, did you miss the mark? It's like, and then, I mean, the funniest thing was the weeks after. It's like, read the room. No, read it now, please. Oh, no, now. How about now? And they're like, no, we got to stick to this. It could have so easily just fizzled out and like we all forget about it, kind of like a Hollywood, star doing something really bad. And then suddenly 2 years later, they're in a new movie and everyone's like, oh, I don't even remember. Did they do something bad?
Yeah.
They had that opportunity. Look, I hope they're right. I hope they're cooking up something that you and I have no idea about, but based on their defenses and everything that they showed coming out of the brand department and the car design department, it's been one enormous train wreck.
So what would you advise them from based on what you know and just some assumptions, because obviously you weren't in those rooms, you don't know the boards that were put up, the strategy that was discussed and all of that, but what would you tell them for a company like that looks like it made a mistake? How would you advise them to reset?
I would, 2 words really: call Fabian. And that's it. Everything else, you got to put the coin in. Yeah. No, I mean, they got so deep into it now, right? That like, after day 1, after day 2, and there's a whole PR crisis, people that can figure this out, because at this point, this is no longer a brand problem. This is like, so much deeper. This is like a PR crisis. This is, the stock fell, like car sales fell. Everything. And this is a fantastic point, actually, Paul, right? Where we talked about it before, where how important is brand strategy and execution? Well, if your stock price plummets and if your car sales go down like crazy based on the logo,
and you're a laughing stock,
maybe there is a lot of power in brand strategy, right? Because if that would have done differently, if it would have been dealt with differently, if it would have been rolled out differently, maybe what they have is really genius, but the rollout was the problem, right? Yeah. Maybe that's the case, and we don't know that, and for whatever reason, they don't let us in, but most likely it's not that.
Well, and even with the logo, I don't absolutely hate the logo. But I think the logo in the context of everything else and the messaging and where they seem to be going with it is what really made the logo even terrible. I don't think
that's exactly right.
Yeah, I don't think the logo was a terrible logo. It feels a little cosmetics, but it wasn't terrible. But I think that you're right in the campaign rollout, the messaging, the visuals, everything else can quickly mess somebody up, and like you said, the stock went down, and the fans of it just were like devastated. They're like, oh my goodness, I dreamt of getting a Jaguar, or I used to have one, or whatever, and it's like I feel like they've killed something precious to me.
Aspiration is gone. There's no more aspiration. If you're turning into a fashion label type lifestyle brand that happens to make cars, no one trusts you with cars anymore, nor will anyone buy your lifestyle swag. So now what's going on with that brand? You completely lost your reason for being, right? And it's so sad, right? When you think about it's a legacy that goes so deep into an entire country and a culture and like a dream that we all bought into. It's like how we said at some point we want to own a Mercedes, or at some point this is. Jaguar is that kind of thing. And they already, over the years, the reason I drove a Jaguar is because they had an entry-level model. I think it was an XF or something, right? I'm like, oh my God, I can get a Jaguar for the same price of an Audi as a lease. I'm going to get the Jaguar. My wife called me a jackass after that, but I got a Jaguar and it was tons of fun. But it's like, but now there's no more aspiration to ever want to get your butt into that type of car, right?
Right. So, these are huge brands that made big mistakes, and I guess Walmart didn't really make a mistake. I think it's a great evolution. I think it's a great refresh. I think it's a great thing. So bringing it down to your more average people, your more regular people, to not make similar mistakes to Jaguar. What are some strategy points that you would say? Here's some things before you do a revolution, not an evolution. And Walmart was an evolution. Before you do a revolution, here are some things to consider when you're doing a rebrand.
I think the number one thing is get your team. Look, I mean, if you can hire a brand strategist to go through the process, absolutely, right? An outsider help formulate that opinion for you, with you. It's absolutely fantastic. Self-servingly so, of course, but I truly believe that, right? If you can't, just get into a room and really rethink what happened over the last months, over the last years. Where's the product at? Where's the service at? Who are we really servicing now? Who will we service in the future? Who are these people? What do they care about today? How does our brand fit in with them? How does our brand fit in with the competitors while standing out? Fitting in, standing out. It's always like this little you gotta do both a little bit, right? And then rewrite your positioning, rewrite who that audience is, why we exist, what our benefits are that we give to our customers, and the big why. It's like, why do we do what we do? What's the fist in the air? And everyone has a fist in the air, right? And for some of them, it's silly and it's not changing the world. Like, we're gonna feed the homeless. It doesn't have to be that. You have to have the fist in the air of like, whatever, quality. That's fist in the air, whatever. There needs to be something that everyone internally and externally feels like, that's it. I call it the brand DNA, right? Like, what's your DNA? And the DNA should not change with any new product launch or with any, like, the DNA should remain the same for years and years and years, right? And once you have that DNA figured out, then you can say, okay, now level set, what do we really need to do? Sometimes it's not even a logo problem. Right? Sometimes it's a naming problem where you're like, hey, our name is so descriptive of the company. And it was descriptive back when we started it 20 years ago. We're now, and that's literally a phone call I had yesterday with a client. It's a naming problem. It's not the design. It's not sometimes it's just a marketing problem.
Yeah. Yeah, even Apple took away Apple Computer and just became Apple because they had to evolve and say, we're not just about computers anymore.
Yeah, exactly. But those decisions are usually made too late, right? And so the problem is communication in companies usually, right? It's like, here's the marketing department, here's the sales department, big line in between the two. No, they should constantly be in communication, right? Yeah. And then there's like the PE firm that comes in and says, hey, you got to change your whole identity to be more modern. Okay, marketing department, do that. Right? But they're not talking to sales. They're not talking to the CEO about the future vision. Like, it's all like just quick meetings, quick emails. It's not, let's get everyone in the room and really hash this out from all perspectives.
Yeah, you said something there that you kind of like said so briefly, but it's so true, is looking at where your audience is, and it might not be the audience that you initially started with. And this sometimes could happen with rapid launches, like, you put it in the market, you test the market, and then the market tells you, and, sometimes you could even launch a product or even branding that you think you understand the audience, but another audience suddenly gravitates to it and becomes a primary audience. And that's where you got to do the execute, evaluate, evolve, because you might have launched rapidly, quickly, get it to market, test the market, minimal viable product. And then you find, what? We're actually attracting more of this group. Yeah. And so that's when you've got to be willing to evolve as a brand. And like you said earlier on, is so many people, they think that once the brand is set, we're good for 50 years, and you're not. You really are not. In 2025, you are not. Most of what you do is soft, but what I mean by soft, it's pixels, it's changeable. Most businesses are soft when it comes to their branding. They don't have signage above a door. They don't have, signage, around a building. They're virtual. They're international. And so changing and evolving is a lot easier when you're soft, when you're pixels. And you've got to keep that in mind.
And I learned it the hard way because I started a product startup a couple of years ago next to my main gig. It's called Tone Optic, and it's for record storage because I'm a record guy, right?
Because you have a lot of records to store.
I have a lot of I had a problem. I had to fix it for myself. So I assumed a certain target audience, and I created a brand for that. And then suddenly my creative director is putting out this thing, and I'm about to approve it, and I'm like, hey, Jesse, the colors are completely different. What are you doing? Like, what's going on? She's like, why did you do it? And she's like, I felt like the brand needed it. And I'm like, oh my God, this is so good. It's like she literally just made an executive decision, basically saying, like, look, like it's evolving. Like there are younger people out there now that like it, and there's like we need to suddenly bring in a different color, and that's how quote unquote the style guide changed that moment.
Right,
And it's
right.
like that makes sense. I sense it too. Like we feel a little stale, or we feel like it's new audience that needs to. So but it's hard to do that as a company, as a corporation, right? To get to those moments. So I think that this almost like when you go to a chiropractor, like every 3-4 months, like that brand chiropractor, where it's not surgery. It's just like, what do we need to tweak a little bit just to keep ahead of the curve?
Get your alignment. Yeah.
Yeah. Get your alignment. Exactly.
Yeah. So, what else would you advise? And I can't believe we're already running out of time here. This has been an amazing conversation. What are some other things, as we talk about a refresh, or even as we talk about, launching a brand, which is what your book's about. And I definitely encourage everybody to go to Amazon and buy all 4 of your books. But what are some other things that you would advise somebody when they're launching a brand, when they're just starting off? What are some additional steps that they need to be really mindful of if they're going to be built to last?
I think I hinted at it before, but when it comes to naming, it's one of those things. It's like you're so tempted to give your company a name that describes your product, but your product will pivot. Like there's a 60%, 70% chance, right?
Yeah.
And like you just said, your target audience will likely shift as well, right? And so if you have a logo, you can do what everyone does, and you can update the logo, either like surgery full on, or just chiropractor, right? But you can change your logo.
Yeah.
You can't do it to a name. You can't just suddenly you have to have a new name, which is a huge deal because it's extremely expensive. I mean, now we're talking about legal fees, we're talking about education, we're talking about like SEO, we're talking about everything. If you have a product, you have to redo all the packaging. If you have a service, you have to redo all of your material. Right. It's not a rebrand visually suddenly becomes a walk in the park. When you actually have to change your name, it becomes a huge deal. So if you're a founder and you're starting a company and you're thinking about a name, and then you see all of these super weird names out there, like my consultancy is called Finian, right? It's like, what does that mean? Well, I love to tell you, but you have to ask, and it's okay because people still remember it. And it's like, there's Tesla, and there's Adobe, and there's Amazon. And when you think about it, it's like Adobe is a clay hut. Tesla is a different person who invented something, not you, right? And like it goes on and on and on. Peloton, no one knows what Peloton is unless you actually really in the scene, right? So it's all of these words, but the words become meaningful because you brand it, right? So much rather go for a name that might be weird in the beginning, but you brand it, like Bon Voy by Marriott. I mean, this is crazy. This is a French word for an international rewards program for Marriott hotels. It's called Bon Voy. It's like, it's hard to say, it's hard to like everything, right? But they pushed through it, they branded the heck out of it, and that's what it is now. Instead of calling it something like Member Rewards Plus, that has no soul, and it might change because you do more than member rewards, right? You do member experiences, whatever it is, right? But that would be a huge thing. Just make sure that when you name the company, go so wide with the name that either it's meaningful on like, again, the brand DNA level or like a big strategic level, or you can change the meaning as you go. If you need to, you can pivot the meaning, right? But that's so important that like, if you get that wrong, it's going to cost you,
Right.
And the good thing is you can pay me for it. So that's the good thing. So screw it up and call me.
Yeah. Then call me when you need help. Yeah. And you're super right. And I think a lot of people, they angst over the name having a ton of meaning. But like you said, sometimes you give it the meaning. Apple, it's a fruit, Google is a misspelling, it's a, and so, you give it the meaning, and you don't have to think that I've got to come up with, and for some people, it doesn't really matter. You can call Bob's Electrical Services. I mean, that's fine. But,
if you Paul, it might change.
Yeah.
Bob's Electrical Services might at some point have to go to solar or something different, and then they call it electrical, and they're not doing electrical. So even that, and if Bob is not around anymore because Bob's dead now, sorry Bob, rest in peace. But now it's like Bill, who's the son, who's taking over.
Right.
Where's Bob?
Right.
Well, he's dead. Well, that's a great story. It's like that makes me feel really warm and fuzzy.
Right. Yeah, I love that. And so you've got a name, you've settled on a name. What's next? The logo?
Well, you created the strategy, you've got the positioning right, you figured out the audience, you now derive the name. So now you build it on a strong platform, and you have all these tools, right? There's the strategy, the name is a branding tool, all of these are tools. Then the logo is next, right? Now you set the logo. And once the logo is done, you create the full-on, I call it brand atmosphere. Right. So you've got your product or your service in the center, and around it is this atmosphere. And users need to poke through this atmosphere. Right. So right now, if they get to know the Finian/Fabian brand, they see me with like allergy eyes and I look like I haven't slept. And that's my brand. Right. That's like one part. Hopefully they're going to go to my website and then they're going to see other things. And they're like, oh, this is actually good. Right. But you see like a trade show, a website, a social media post, or whatever it is. Right. And you poke through it in order to get to the product. So I call it the brand atmosphere. So once you have all of these components, you start designing a couple of pieces. You start designing, a hang tag or a social media post or an email signature or an e-blast, and you start playing with the colors and the designs and really going back to the brand strategy. How do we need to evoke that love? Like, what can we create that actually brings it all together? And then you settle on something and you say, good. Those are the colors. Those are the fonts. Again, have fun with it. Yeah. Try to stick to it. If you need to make a change, let's talk and make a change if it's really appropriate, and keep it organic. But there still needs to be some sort of guardrails, even though the guardrails are further and further away, right? You still can't bounce out of certain guardrails, right? Like it still needs to be your brand, right?
Right. Well, and that consistency that also develops within those guardrails and that atmosphere, right? Because that augments the power of an impression. When you put something out there, if there's a consistency in voice, in look and feel, in everything that you're doing, it just kind of multiplies the impact when it's everywhere consistent. It feels like it's omnipresent when you're that focused in.
I think that's what we fight all the time. It's like the difference between the fight between consistent and stale. Mm-hmm. And it's like we always have to fight that, right? Because it has to be consistent for me to immediately see, oh, this is that airline. That's that airline, right? Yeah. And then it has to be modern and exciting enough to be like, oh, it's that airline, and they're doing cool stuff, and they're moving up, no pun intended, right? I'm working with an airline now, so it's like in my head. But it's like, that's the kind of thing, right? Yeah. So where is that fine line? And then like, I created a campaign yesterday for an airline, and they're like, well, we should go to safe route. And then the CMO is like, no, we should go the new route. And then the designer is like, but it's so different. And then the CMO is like, this is our moment to push the brand up a little further, right? And now we're going to dance after this, and then we're going to dance a new dance. And that I love, right? Yeah. That idea of like, okay, we're pushing a little. It's not consistent anymore. Yeah, but it's a new consistent. Right. And I love that. And it has to happen at some point. And sometimes it's a campaign, and sometimes it's a big refresh. But yeah.
Yeah, I love that, because, the difference between consistent and stale, there is a fine line. And I would almost say that stale is never changing. But you can be consistent within these pockets of seasons and say, we have now moved into this new season, and we are going to be consistent within that season. And then as we evolve, then we are consistent within that season. But, it's not consistent. It's not a timeline. It's almost these pockets of seasons that you stay consistent within that season. Whereas stale is, well, we created that logo, 50 years ago, and this is who we are, and this is what we're about, and we're not changing anything. And that's when you get stale and irrelevant. And so I love the way you've described that.
Just to add to that, I think it's really interesting to look at car companies and the way that a car's grille, right, like the front of a car, how it is evolving every season. Right. Yeah. Every time there's a new car coming out, which is every year usually, right? there are every 4 or 5 years, it changes completely, right? But it still has the DNA. There's still something where you can see this is an Audi and this is a Beamer and whatever. But usually during those 5 years, it's just these small incremental updates that still excite people to get the latest model. I think it's a really good analogy to how branding should work. It's this constant,
constant improvement, constant awareness of the culture, constant awareness of the times, constant awareness of the seasons that allows
the competition too.
And competition and technology. I mean, we haven't even talked about AI, but, just the technology of phones changed everything. The technology of social media changed everything. And so you've got to have your hand on the pulse. And if not you, then you need to call Fabian or somebody else that stays in touch with this stuff.
What do you mean somebody else? Is there anyone else? Who do you see? There's only the two of us.
Yeah, that's right. Contact Paul or Fabian at paulandfabian.com. Yeah,
exactly.
No, really, that's not an existing URL. But this has been amazing, man. I'm sure we could talk for another few hours, but I know you've got a heart out. How do people get a hold of you? Who can you help? Who can you not help? And what's the best way to get a hold of you?
Yeah, I think who I can help, we talked about quite a bit, right? It's like usually I work with companies that go through a transition. So it's like either like a CEO change, CMO change, a change in competition, change in landscape, a PE firm comes in, whatever it is. And I hold hands during the entire, like rebrand and transformation of that. It's usually a 3-month process. That's really at the core of it. I do help a lot of designers and brand strategists as well. I've got like mentorship, opportunities. I've got calls for entrepreneurs to just talk with me for like 15 minutes running by something, by me. So you can go to Finian.com, FINIEN.com, or resourcehub.finian.com, or hit me up on LinkedIn. I've got a very uncomplicated last name. Should be a walk in the park.
And I'll put those links in the show notes as well for you to get a hold of Fabian and learn some great stuff. Enjoy his therapy, his brand therapy on every Thursday, or is it Tuesday? It's every Tuesday.
It's Thursday. Brand Therapy Thursday.
Brand Therapy Thursday, and enjoy that. Well, man, Fabian, this has been amazing. I appreciate you coming on.
Hey, I appreciate you having me. This was it was a good talk. It was brand therapy talk. That's what it was. It felt great. Yeah.
It was.
I'm feeling good now.
Me too. This has been fantastic. Well, you have a great day. Take care.
Absolutely. You too.